Welcome to Surreal Noir. I'm your host, Kate Laity. That was Healing Music by No He, No She, which is Eleni Pulu and Petr Step-Kisor. I think we all need some healing, have been needing healing, maybe a little more now as the months go on and the virus continues. This is an unusual episode. I know too few to have an unusual, but this is an unusual episode because I am traveling and cobbling things together from various formats. So we'll see how it looks in the end. I guess we'll see how it sounds in the end. Traveling is usually something that I eagerly look forward to, but at present traveling is more difficult and undertaken for reasons that can't be put off, which is to say duty rather than pleasure. So thinking of traveling, I'm going to use as one of the themes for this episode Patricia Highsmith's Strangers on a Train, which my students have been reading. And if you've not read it or not seen the film, which is rather different from the book in many ways, which is not unusual. Films are a different medium, but also it takes a very different tack on things. Behind the scenes, it's kind of interesting. When Hitchcock decided he wanted to buy the novel to turn it into a film, he negotiated through a third party so that Patricia Highsmith would not know who was bidding on the rights to her novel. So, yeah, she probably sold it for less than she might have got otherwise, which did not form a good opinion of Hollywood for her. And she continued to have some reservations about the films that were made from her books. Rarely did she like any of them. In large part probably because rarely did they follow the arc of her narratives. So here's a little clip from Strangers on a Train to give you an idea of the central issue of what the novel is about. And this is from the Hitchcock film. And I'll talk a little bit after.
Now, let's say that you'd like to get rid of your wife.
It's a morbid thought.
No. Just suppose. Let's say that you had a very good reason.
Let's
say that you'd be afraid to kill her. You know why? You'd get caught. And what would trip you up? The motive. Now, here's my idea.
I'm afraid I haven't got time to listen.
Listen. It's so simple, too. Two fellows meet accidentally, like you and me. No connection between them at all. Never saw each other before. Each one has somebody that he'd like to get rid of. So, they swap murders.
Swap murders?
Each fellow does the other fellow's murder. Then there's nothing to connect them. Each one has murdered a total stranger. Like, you do my murder. I do yours.
We're coming into my station.
For example, your wife, my father. Criss-cross. What? Oh, we do talk the same language, don't we?
Well, sure, Bruno. We talk the same language. Thanks for the lunch.
Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed it. I thought the lamb chops were a little overdone myself.
Nice meeting you.
Now, you think my theory's okay, guy? You like it?
Sure, Bruno. Sure. They're all okay.
Criss-cross, an exchange of murders between two people who've never met before. The perfect crime. In theory, anyway. Nothing, of course, ever turns out that way. Nothing, of course, ever turns out as planned, especially crime. The film version of Strangers on a Train by Alfred Hitchcock stars, in that clip, Farley Granger as Guy Haines, and Robert Walker as Bruno. In the film, as in the book, the murder idea is Bruno's, In the film, however, Guy is the innocent dupe. Doesn't take Bruno seriously, as you can probably hear from that clip, and cannot extricate himself from what goes wrong once it starts to go wrong. Not surprisingly, the book is much more ambivalent, which is to say, it's Highsmith. As an interesting trivia tidbit, when trying to get the rights for the novel, which was Highsmith's first published novel, Hitchcock negotiated through a third party so that she wouldn't know it was this famous director trying to buy the rights. So he got it for much cheaper than he probably would have otherwise. So this is the beginning of the rather sour relationship with Hollywood that Highsmith had through most of her life. She was rarely happy with the film versions of her novels, with good reason. They seldom followed her novel. Important changes, nuances lost. Any writer is probably going to be unhappy in at least some regards with the adaptation of a novel to a film. A film, even as they seem to get longer and longer, doesn't have the time to deal with all the nuance of a novel. Novellas, in this case, are actually the perfect length for adapting to a movie, but nobody reads novellas, I'm told. I could just keep writing them. But the nuance of this book is what really makes it fascinating, and I think long beyond Hitchcock's thriller, which is fun and exciting, where the architect, Guy Haynes, becomes the tennis player. And again, for visual adaptation, it's much more exciting to watch a tennis match than it is to watch an architect think. Film is often challenged by the idea of showing people thinking, or at least Hollywood films are not too good at that idea. But also this idea of guilt. Guy is a much more ambiguous character in the novel, and part of it is his passivity in the face of what he sees as things he can do nothing about. But the other part of it is things that he recognizes in himself, qualities that he recognizes. He talks at one point of recognizing a flaw within himself, like the flaw within a jewel, a weakness, something that's not quite true in the sense of right. And he struggles with this, and his mood shifts are all over the place. He's in some ways very childish, and he's resentful about his wife that he wants to be ex-wife, because of course now he's met the perfect woman. And yes, you can guess from the childishness of that belief that he's met the perfect woman, and that he's always better around her, in part because he behaves differently around her, and his new love that he wants to divorce his wife Miriam to marry. And Miriam, of course, the kind of person who takes advantage of somebody like Guy because, frankly, he's somebody who's easy to take advantage of. He doesn't know what he wants. He's not willing to go after what he wants. And he's very passive in the face of what he sees as fate. Something happens and he feels powerless to do anything about it. But there are some really interesting moments that have a lot to do with what happens with Highsmith as her career goes on. This is her first published novel, and many of the things in it touch on tropes that she will return to later. But they also mask things that she's not quite sure about herself yet as a young writer. People who know her later career, where she becomes increasingly misanthropic and all of her prejudices start to become front and center, will be surprised to hear that as a young woman, especially at Barnard College, she was very much a leftist, at times even communist socialist. And this is something that changed over time. And part of it had to do with her own unusual personality. And part of it had to do with her experiences and how she interpreted them. Her diaries, or at least a portion of her diaries, will be coming out in October, I believe it is. So it will be very interesting to see those and to see what kind of insight they offer. Part of what's interesting about the idea of the criss-cross crime is that it really does take both of them in order to happen, not just because of the idea of exchanging murders, but because here are two people who probably never would have been drawn into murder if they had not met one another in this very common noir trope of the folie à deux, two people who have a madness together. And Guy and Bruno certainly do in both the novel and to a lesser extent in the film. It's almost all the blame is laid on Bruno in the film. But in the book, it's much more ambivalent, and we spend a lot more time in Guy's head, and we see a lot of his ambivalence. And it can be, I have to see more of what my students will be writing about it, but it's very fascinating to see the way that Guy vacillates, constantly vacillates. And what he, sudden bouts of anger, he recognizes that he has a rage inside him, and he's not sure how to deal with it. And one of the things that's sort of at the heart of his rage is, of course, his soon-to-be ex-wife, or what he hopes will soon be his ex-wife, Miriam. And there's a great passage where he's talking about her to Anne, his girlfriend that he wants to marry. And he just goes off. And the way that he goes off tells us a great deal about what's inside him. She's everything that should be loathed, he went on, staring in front of him. Sometimes I think I hate everything in the world. No decency, no conscience. She's what people mean when they say America never grows up. America rewards the corrupt. She's the type who goes to the bad movies, acts in them, reads the love story magazines, lives in a bungalow, and whips her husband into earning more money this year so they can buy on the installment plan next year, breaks up her neighbor's marriage. Stop it, Guy. You talk so like a child. She drew away from him. And the fact that I once loved her, Guy added, loved all of it, makes me ill. So it's something within himself that he just can't bear. And that was Ashes in the Wind by Rachel Portman from the soundtrack to Chocolat. When people talk about contemporary film composers, I'm always surprised that more people do not mention Rachel Portman. Her work is beautiful, layered, textured, very thoughtful, but doesn't get the same attention, which is a pity. Chocolat especially is a wonderful film based on a wonderful book, but it's also, the soundtrack is just extraordinarily beautiful. And if you haven't checked it out, I would definitely recommend it. A book that also picks up on the theme of travel. The surrealist for this episode is also someone who is deeply inspired by her travels across Europe, the Middle East, and in the Americas, from the very far north of Canada through the U.S., especially the western part, and then down into Mexico, where she stayed for a while and was deeply inspired by the landscape there and made friends with many people. Of course, the surrealists, Leonora Carrington and Remedios Varo were there in Mexico City, but also Frida Kahlo. Alice Rahon was very good friends with Frida Kahlo. In fact, one of her paintings was in honor and recognition of that friendship. And her art has a richness that is in the landscape, especially the landscape of Mexico. The bluest blues of nighttime, but also the reds and browns of the mountains and the deserts, and a very evocative style that was influenced by being introduced to cave paintings and indigenous art in the North and in Mexico, where she thought a lot about this idea of the long tradition of painting and the long tradition of art as something that communicates across the ages, but also is something that comes only from going within. There's a wonderful piece that she wrote for her solo show at the Willard Gallery in 1951, and I just want to read a couple of passages from that. In the earliest times, painting was magical. It was a key to the invisible. In those days, the value of a work lay in its powers of conjuration, a power that talent alone could not achieve. Like the shaman, the sibyl, and the wizard, the painter had to make himself humble so that he could share in the manifestations of spirits and forms. The rhythm of our life today denies the primordial principle of painting. Conceived in contemplation, the emotional content of the picture cannot be perceived without contemplation. The invisible speaks to us, and the world it paints takes the form of apparitions. It awakens in each of us that yearning for the marvelous, and shows us the way back to it, the way that is the great conquest of childhood, and which is lost to us with the rational concepts of education. Perhaps we have seen the Emerald City in some faraway dream that belongs to the common emotional fund of man. Entering by the gate of the 7 colors, we travel along the rainbow. For Alice Rahon, there's a great deal of power that lies within all of us, but there's an almost magical need to turn inward in that contemplation in order to reach it. It's not possible to reach otherwise, and we cannot truly appreciate art until we look at it with the same contemplation. So work done by the artist must also be work done by the viewer. It's a concept that asks a lot, not only of the practitioner, but of the audience willing to take it. And we all know that most people don't take the time to contemplate art that deeply. But certainly when you create work that invites it, it's easier to see that happen. But it's not always easy to get that magic. That was Vartina with Kula Vuoti Uta Kuta, which is a song of the village coming out under the new moon to welcome the new bride. Not the kind of welcome you can always get, but one of the beautiful tracks from Zelenico. Getting back to Strangers on a Train. There's a wonderful, I don't know if that's the word to describe it, but there's this really great passage where, having committed murder, Bruno imagines being interviewed, because of course, even when we're talking, what is this, 1940s, 50s? I have to look up the date. That the idea of having that kind of media fame is important. And he even makes an oblique reference to the Leopold and Loeb murder case and finds himself, of course, superior to that, because of course he would. That's Bruno. This is his memorialization of having committed the perfect murder. He was not like the dopes in the newspaper who killed to see what it felt like. I never had a bloody thing to report except sometimes a sick-making. It wasn't as good as I expected. If he were interviewed, he would say, "It was terrific. There's nothing in the world like it." "Would you ever do it again, Mr. Bruno?" "Well, I might," reflectively, with caution, as an Arctic explorer, when asked if he will winter up north again next year, might reply, uncommittingly to a reporter, Can you tell us a little bit more about your sensations? He would tip the microphone toward him, look up and muse, while the world awaited his first word. How had it felt? Well, there's only it, see, and nothing to compare it with. She was a rotten woman anyway, you understand. It was like killing a hot little rat. Only she was a girl, so it made it murder. The very warmth of her had been disgusting, and he remembered thinking that, before he took his fingers away, the heat would really have stopped coming, that after he left her she would grow chill and hideous, like she really was. Hideous, Mr. Bruno? Yes, hideous. Hideous like she really was. Do you think a corpse is hideous? Bruno frowned. No, he did not really think that he thought a corpse was hideous. If the victim was evil, like Miriam, people ought to be pretty glad to see the corpse, oughtn't they? Power, Mr. Bruno? Oh, yes, he had felt terrific power. That was it. He had taken away a life. Now nobody knew what life was. Everybody defended it, the most priceless possession, but he had taken one away. That night there had been the danger, the ache of his hands, the fear in case she made a sound. But that instant when he felt that life had left her, everything else had fallen away, and only the mysterious fact of the thing he did remained. The mystery and the miracle of stopping life. People talked about the mystery of birth, of beginning life, but how explainable that was. Out of 2 live germ cells. What about the mystery of stopping life? Why should life stop because he held a girl's throat too tightly? What was life anyway? What did Miriam feel after he took his hands away? Where was she? No, he didn't believe in life after death. She was stopped. She was stopped. That was the miracle. Oh, he could say a great deal at his interview with the press. What significance did it have for you that your victim was female? Where had that question come from? Bruno hesitated, then recovered his poise. Well, the fact that she was female had given him a greater enjoyment. No, he did not therefore conclude that his pleasure had partaken of the sexual. No, he did not hate women either. Rather not. Hate is akin to love, you know. Who said that? He didn't believe it for a minute. No, all he would say is that he wouldn't have enjoyed it quite so much, he thought, if he had killed a man. Unless it was his father. The incredible ego of Bruno, but also the underlying misogyny. Other than his mother, he has no interest in or affection for women of any kind. But it is fascinating that his first thought after the murder is to get a drink because, of course, Bruno is an alcoholic. But his second thought was to get a prostitute. And this is like the only reference to sex in his life at all. Other than his very strong attachment to Guy, he shows no sort of sexual interest in anything. But that moment after the murder, there's such a swell of potency, so to speak, that he runs out and finds, near the murder scene, finds someone, a taxi driver, who can get him to a prostitute. And he goes to a prostitute. So while he is assuring this imaginary audience that there was nothing sexual about it, there clearly was. And this sense of the power that it took is something that for him comes out in this anomalous sexual moment. It's really fascinating. And it's quite interesting how his situation is much different from what happens with Guy. I don't want to spoil too much about the book. But the second half of the book, after Miriam's murder, goes in a lot of directions that you might not expect and are much more interesting and difficult than the film, which, of course, Guy Haynes is just a tennis player in love with a senator's daughter who must be rescued at the last minute through fiat, skill, and daring. He is not rescued in the novel. Nobody's rescued in the novel. And all of the people in it, like most of Highsmith's books, all of the people seem a little odd. And probably that's down to Highsmith herself. All right, back to music. And something fairly new. I know I've played a lot of old tracks. Something fairly new. This is The Mangrove Forest by Kayla Painter. This show is dedicated to the interplay between the verbal and the visual. And sometimes it seems odd that to do this in audio form, but why not? As surreal as anything. One of the paintings I wanted to think about for this episode by Highsmith is Painting for a Little Ghost Who Couldn't Learn to Read, which is a fascinating concept in itself. A ghost who can't read, couldn't learn to read. Is it prevented from reading, or just couldn't manage it? Is it too hard to read when you're a ghost? Unless you have a ghost instructor. Perhaps. The painting has the colors that I associate with her time in Mexico. A rich blue background that is overlaid with layers and scrapings and other colors. And then this rich orange and brown and yellow that is very much of the same palette that she employed as she was painting in Mexico. She started out as a poet. Maybe I should grab one of her poems and read that too. But I wanted to think about this painting because it just endlessly fascinates me. It's got a number of kites and a bird and what seems to be the young ghost. At least there's what appears to be maybe a little dress and legs holding one of the kites. I'm guessing kites. And there's an air to it of motion. All of the things that a flat, two-dimensional image can suggest, in the same way that mere words can create pictures in your mind. Here's a literal picture, but it creates in your mind so much more. The story behind it, what's happening, and who is her little companion. And the bird that looks like a toy. It's very hard to say. I'm throwing Rahon under the large and porous umbrella of the surrealists, but when asked what school she belonged to, what umbrella she belonged under, she said, "I think I'm a cave painter," which I think is a great answer. All right, I will read one of her poems because she's such a fascinating figure. Someone who starts as a poet, becomes a painter, even a sculptor. She created puppets. She traveled widely. She was influenced by all the things she saw. She took them in and transformed them in her art in ways that were unpredictable. But even back in the poetry, there's something that presages the work that came out in the painting. This is a poem called I File the Bars. I file the bars of my invisible prison. I sigh like horses sigh. I pack away the baby clothes. I offer up hearts and hands. I turn ahead towards mine. I see branches like birds turning their white face to the sky. I chime the unknown hours. I arrive without leaving. I hold on to, I let go of threads. I sleep on my hair. I do not look back. My eyes don't obey me. My body doesn't obey me. My hands belong to a stranger. I am spinning this straw until it turns to gold. So much in there to unpack, but it's such a beautiful and powerful poem and has so much sadness and yet hope. Determination. I am spinning this straw until it turns to gold. All right, in honor of crossing boundaries and traveling to follow your muse and your heart. Here is Bishi with Language is an Ocean. Well, down to the end of another episode. I hope I've piqued your interest with a little Patricia Highsmith and Alice Rahon, who is perhaps one of the lesser well-known people who fall under the umbrella of surrealists. Certainly check out her poetry and her art. There's a new book on her that came out from the Gallery Wendy Norris. That's what I was checking out. And I highly recommend Patricia Highsmith if you like your fiction dark. If you don't like it quite so dark, then see the Hitchcock movie. It's also very good and very interesting. And of course, he does a lot of things that are always disturbing and fascinating and manipulative of the audience, because film is manipulative. That's what it does. My students are moving on this week to reading Carol, originally published as The Price of Salt. There are no murders in. It's perhaps the only Highsmith book without, well, I want to say without crime. It's not entirely without crime, but it's quite an anomaly. And for a lesbian novel written in the 1950s, it's unusual in having a happy ending. Come to think of it, for Highsmith novels, that's unusual enough. All right, sending you out with something upbeat. Oya's song from Ubaka Hill. So let the drums take us out.